A German shepherd stood in the middle of a quiet shelter hallway, not barking, not pulling away, just watching the man in front of him, as if trying to decide something. The Navy SEAL didn't move any closer. He had seen hesitation before, in war, in people, and sometimes in himself. The walls around them were lined with open kennels and empty promises. Dogs had come and gone all day, but this one hadn't. Not because no one noticed him, but because something about him made people pause and then walk away. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly. Not in fear, not in submission, just enough to keep distance. Why would a trained, disciplined dog refuse the simplest thing, trust? And why did that hesitation feel so familiar to a man who had spent years avoiding it himself? Before we begin, tell me, have you ever stood this close to something and still couldn't reach it? Late afternoon leaned heavily over the coastal town, the kind of humid South Carolina heat that didn't burn so much as it lingered, pressing against the skin like a quiet insistence. The air carried salt from the nearby marsh, mixed with the faint metallic scent of rust and old engines. It was the kind of place where things aged slowly, not all at once, but enough that you could feel time sitting in the corners, watching. Daniel Hayes preferred it that way. He stood at the edge of a half-repaired fishing boat, sleeves rolled just below his elbows, exposing forearms marked with pale scars that didn't belong to any one story. At 38, Daniel had the kind of face that looked carved rather than grown. Sharp jawline, faint lines etched permanently around his eyes, as if he had spent too long squinting into something he didn't fully understand. His hair, dark brown with early threads of gray at the temples, was kept short out of habit more than preference. A light beard shadowed his face, never fully grown, never completely gone, like everything else in his life, unfinished by design. He worked in silence, not the peaceful kind, but the deliberate kind, the kind that kept things from surfacing. A wrench turned in his hand. Metal clicked against metal. He paused, just for a second, staring at the bolt like it had done something wrong. Then he finished tightening it and stepped back. The boat didn't belong to him. Nothing here did. That was the point. Daniel didn't own the marina, didn't have a long-term contract, didn't even keep more than a week's worth of groceries at home. He moved through things lightly. Jobs, places, conversations. It wasn't that he disliked people. It was just that staying required something he had quietly decided he no longer had. Or maybe something he didn't trust himself with. A faint metallic sound drifted across the air. Not loud, not sudden, just out of place. Daniel didn't turn immediately. He waited, like he always did, giving the world a chance to explain itself before he reacted. When nothing followed, he finally looked up. Across the narrow gravel path, beyond a strip of dry grass, stood a small, weathered house with peeling pale blue paint and a porch that leaned ever so slightly to one side. Hanging from the edge of that porch was a wind chime, thin strips of metal, dulled with age, suspended from a simple circular frame. It moved. Barely. There was no wind. Daniel's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, then relaxed again. He turned back to the boat as if the moment hadn't earned more than that. It usually didn't. The front door of the house creaked open. Margaret Collins stepped out slowly, one hand bracing the frame before she let herself fully onto the porch. She was a woman well into her 70s, though there was something in the way she carried herself that resisted being defined by numbers. Her frame was slender but not fragile, her shoulders slightly stooped in a way that suggested not weakness, but years of holding something heavy without ever setting it down. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, had softened into a pale silver, pulled loosely back into a low knot that never quite stayed in place. Strands escaped around her temples, catching the light. Her skin bore the fine lines of time, but her eyes clear, steady. An unyielding gray remained sharp, in a way that made people pause before speaking. She looked at the wind chime, not surprised, not curious, just attentive. Daniel watched her now, though he kept his posture casual, as if his attention had simply wandered in that direction by accident. Margaret reached out, and steadied one of the metal strips between her fingers. It stopped moving immediately. Silence returned. Then she turned her head slightly, not enough to fully face him, but enough to acknowledge his presence. "You hear it too?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but not weak. It carried the quiet confidence of someone who didn't ask questions unless she already suspected the answer. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, buying himself a second. "Probably just a draft," he said, tone neutral. Margaret gave a faint, almost amused exhale, not quite a laugh. "There hasn't been a draft here in years." Daniel didn't respond. He rarely did when conversation started to lean somewhere he didn't intend to follow. Margaret didn't press. She never did. That was part of what made her different from the others in town, the ones who asked too many questions disguised as friendliness. She simply nodded once, as if filing his answer away, then turned back toward her door. But before she stepped inside, she said, "It wasn't always like that." Daniel's gaze flicked back to the wind chime, despite himself. "What wasn't?" he asked. She paused, one hand on the doorframe again. "The sound," she said. "It used to need wind." There was a space after that sentence. Not silence exactly, but something heavier, like a thought left unfinished on purpose. Then she went inside. The door closed. Daniel stood there a moment longer than he meant to. The chime didn't move again. He went back to work. Daniel's house sat 2 streets over, small and square, the kind of place that could belong to anyone because it didn't seem shaped by anyone in particular. Inside, everything was arranged with a kind of practical precision tools where they needed to be. Surfaces clear, no photographs, no decorations beyond what had come with the house itself. There were no traces of a past life here. That was intentional. He set his keys down in the same spot he always did, kicked off his boots, and moved through the space without turning on the television or any music. The quiet followed him, familiar and controlled. Then, faintly, a metallic note. Daniel stopped mid-step. It came from outside, not loud, not insistent, but unmistakable. He walked to the window, slow enough that it didn't feel like a reaction. Across the narrow yard, Margaret's porch was visible through a break in the fence line. The wind chime moved. Again, no trees nearby stirred. The air hung thick and still, as if even the insects had decided not to move. Daniel watched it longer this time, long enough to notice that the rhythm wasn't random. 3 soft taps, pause, then nothing. He stepped back from the window. "This is nothing," he said under his breath, though no one was there to hear it. He had learned, a long time ago, that naming something too early gave it weight, and weight was dangerous. So he let it go, like he always did. The next morning came without ceremony, the sky already pale and heavy before the sun fully climbed. Daniel returned to the marina, finishing what he had started the day before, keeping his focus on things that made sense. Measurements, angles, resistance under his hands, things that responded, predictably. Around mid-afternoon, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't answer it immediately. He rarely did. When it buzzed again, he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. Then something habit, instinct, or maybe just a break in his usual pattern made him swipe to answer. "Hayes," he said, voice flat. A woman's voice came through, professional but slightly hesitant, as if she had made several calls like this already today. "Mr. Hayes? This is Sarah Whitaker from the Coastal Military Working Dog Rehabilitation Center." Daniel's posture shifted just a fraction. Sarah Whitaker. Early 40s, maybe. He pictured her automatically, the type he had met before, in briefings and evaluations. Focused, composed, carrying responsibility, in the way she chose her words. The kind of person who didn't waste time, but didn't rush either. "Yes," he said. "We were given your name through a prior contact," she continued. "We're currently handling a case that requires behavioral assessment from someone with your background." Daniel's eyes moved out over the water, though he wasn't seeing it. "I'm not active," he said. "Not defensive, just factual." "We're aware," Sarah replied. "This isn't an operational request. It's a final evaluation." There was something in the way she said final that didn't sit cleanly. "Daniel," didn't speak. A German Shepherd, she added, after a brief pause. Former working dog. History of service. Complications. Post-deployment. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had heard that phrasing before. Too many times. What kind of complications? He asked. Another pause. Unpredictable behavior. Non-compliance. One recorded incident involving aggression toward a handler. She said carefully. He's scheduled for transfer if we can't establish baseline stability. Transfer. Another word that meant more than it said. Daniel looked down at his hands, still faintly marked with grease. I don't do long-term, he said. This wouldn't be long-term, Sarah answered. Just an assessment. One visit. We need someone who understands both sides of the equation. Daniel almost asked what she meant by that. He didn't. Instead, his gaze drifted unintentionally toward the direction of Margaret's house, though he couldn't see it from here. The memory of the wind chime flickered through his mind. 3 taps. Pause. Nothing. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. When? He asked. There was a subtle shift in Sarah's tone relief, held in check. Tomorrow, if possible. Daniel nodded once, though she couldn't see it. I'll come by, he said. He ended the call before she could thank him. For a moment, he stood there, phone still in his hand. Then he slipped it back into his pocket and turned to the boat, picking up his tools like nothing had changed. But something had. He had said yes. And Daniel Hayes didn't usually stay long enough to do that. Morning arrived without sharp edges. The sky washed in a pale gray that felt undecided, as if it had not yet committed to being either clear or storm-bound. The air held a thin layer of warmth, damp but tolerable, the kind that clung quietly rather than pressing. Daniel Hayes drove along the narrow coastal road, with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel and the other draped over the open window, fingers catching the slow drift of humid air. He had not spoken since leaving the house. There had been no reason to. The wind chime had not made a sound that morning, but that absence felt no more reassuring than its presence. He told himself he wasn't thinking about it. The truth was, he had simply decided not to follow the thought further. The Coastal Military Working Dog Rehabilitation Center stood just beyond the edge of town, separated from everything else by a stretch of gravel and low fencing that seemed more symbolic than secure. It wasn't large, but it was deliberate, clean lines, functional buildings, nothing decorative. The kind of place built for purpose, not comfort. Daniel parked without hurry, cutting the engine and sitting for a moment longer than necessary. Not hesitation, just recalibration. Then, he stepped out. Inside, the facility smelled faintly of antiseptic and something older metal, worn surfaces, a trace of animal presence that never quite left, no matter how often the place was cleaned. A woman stood near the front desk, reviewing a clipboard. She looked up as the door closed behind him. Sarah Whitaker matched his expectations almost exactly, though there were details that didn't translate from voice to presence. She stood around 5'7", her posture straight without being rigid. The kind of natural alignment that came from years of holding responsibility rather than practicing it. Her hair was a muted blonde, pulled into a low ponytail that rested against the collar of her shirt. A few loose strands framed her face, softening the otherwise precise lines of her features. Her skin carried a light tan, uneven in places, suggesting long days spent outdoors rather than intentional exposure. Her eyes, blue, steady, observant, did not linger in a way that felt intrusive, but they missed very little. "Mr. Hayes," she said, setting the clipboard aside. Her voice held the same controlled calm as before, but there was something else beneath it, now fatigue, carefully managed. "I appreciate you coming." Daniel nodded once. "You said it wouldn't take long." "It won't," she replied. Then, after a brief pause, "At least, not on your end." There was something in that phrasing that suggested the rest of the process had already taken longer than expected. She led him down a hallway, lined with enclosed kennels. Some were empty, others held dogs that lifted their heads as he passed, alert, curious, responsive. A few barked, not aggressively, just announcing presence. Daniel barely glanced at them. He was listening for something else, or maybe noticing the lack of it. They stopped near the end of the corridor. The kennel there looked no different from the others. Same structure, same reinforced bars, same neutral flooring. But the space inside it felt still. Not quiet in the absence of noise sense. Quiet in the sense of something withholding itself. "That's him," Sarah said. Daniel stepped closer. The German Shepherd stood near the back of the enclosure, body angled slightly away. Not in retreat, but not facing forward either. He was large, lean rather than bulky, muscles defined but not exaggerated. His coat was black and tan, though the black seemed to dominate more heavily along his back and shoulders, fading unevenly into a muted brown along his legs. His fur was clean, but carried a dullness that didn't come from neglect. More from something internal, like the absence of energy, had somehow translated into texture. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move toward them. His head remained slightly lowered, ears not pinned back, not alert, just neutral. And his eyes dark, almost unreadable, never once lifted to meet Daniel's. "How long has he been like this?" Daniel asked. "Since he arrived," Sarah said. "And before that, according to the transfer notes." Daniel watched the dog for a moment longer. "He's not shutting down," he said quietly. Sarah's brow shifted slightly. "No? No," Daniel replied. "Shutdown looks different. This is selective." That caught her attention. She stepped closer, standing just behind his shoulder. "Selective how?" "He's choosing what not to engage with," Daniel said. "That's not the same as being unable to." The dog shifted his weight subtle, almost imperceptible, but not in response to Sarah. Not to Daniel's voice either. Something else. Daniel noticed it immediately. "What's his name?" he asked. "Riley," Sarah said. 6 years old, formerly assigned to a joint operations unit, detection and patrol support. Daniel exhaled softly through his nose. "Yeah," he murmured. "That tracks." Sarah studied him now, more directly. "You see something?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched slightly, not too close to the kennel, just enough to change his line of sight. Riley's ears flicked once, but his head remained angled away. "He's not avoiding us," Daniel said finally. "He's avoiding something specific." Sarah followed his gaze, though there was nothing visible in that direction, just the empty space beyond the kennel wall. "We've run full behavioral assessments," she said. "Stimuli tests, command response, environmental exposure. Nothing consistent." Daniel stood again. "What about the incident?" Sarah hesitated. Then she nodded once, as if confirming something internally. "I'll show you." They moved into a small office nearby. The room was sparse desk, 2 chairs, a monitor mounted against the wall. Sarah pulled up a file, fingers moving with practiced efficiency, though Daniel noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. A video began to play. The footage was shaky, clearly recorded in the middle of an operation. Dust, shouting, rapid movement, too many variables compressed into too little time. Riley appeared in frame briefly, moving with precision, responding to commands, alert but controlled. Then everything shifted. A sudden noise, sharp, disorienting. The handler, a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered dark hair, cropped short, face partially obscured by gear, reached for Riley, either to restrain or redirect. Riley reacted. Fast. He lunged, not wildly, not erratically, but with direct force, teeth connecting with the handler's arm. Not prolonged, not repeated, just one decisive action. Then he released. The handler staggered back. The footage cut shortly after. Silence settled into the room. "That's Sergeant Michael Torres," Sarah said quietly. "Handler for 3 years. No prior incidents." Daniel leaned back slightly, arms crossing loosely over his chest. His expression hadn't changed much, but something in his gaze had sharpened. "Play it again," he said. Sarah did. This time, Daniel watched not the bite but the seconds before it. The angle of Riley's body, the direction of his focus, the moment his posture shifted. There, Daniel said, pointing just before the lunge. Sarah paused the video. What am I looking at? She asked. He's not reacting to Torres, Daniel said. Not directly. Then what? He's blocking something, Daniel interrupted. Sarah frowned. Blocking what? There's nothing there. Daniel didn't answer immediately, because that was the problem. Riley hadn't attacked. He had intervened. Daniel let out a slow breath. You're reading this as instability, he said. It's not. Sarah's voice lowered. Then what is it? Daniel looked back toward the door, toward the hallway where Riley waited in that quiet, deliberate stillness. It's misinterpretation, he said. The word hung there, not as an excuse, as a correction. They returned to the kennel. Riley hadn't moved much. Same position, same angle, same refusal to meet their eyes. Daniel stepped closer this time, not enough to invade the space, just enough to shift the dynamic. For a brief second, so brief, it could have been missed, Riley's gaze flickered, not to Daniel's face, to his hands, then away again. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. He crouched slowly, extending his hand, not toward Riley, but slightly to the side, leaving space, leaving choice. Riley didn't approach, but he didn't retreat either. Sarah watched in silence. Minutes passed. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was exactly what mattered. Daniel stood up again. He's not unpredictable, he said. He's precise. Sarah's voice was quieter now. And the bite was a decision, Daniel said, not a failure. She studied him carefully. So what happens now? Daniel glanced at Riley one more time. The dog still wasn't looking at him, but he wasn't ignoring him either. That difference was everything. I take him, Daniel said. Sarah blinked once. Take him, as in, out, Daniel replied. With me. She hesitated, clearly weighing protocol against instinct. This isn't a standard transfer. I know, Daniel said. It's not a standard case. Silence stretched between them. Then Sarah nodded. All right, she said. We'll process the release. Daniel didn't thank her. He didn't need to. As she walked away to handle the paperwork, he remained where he was, eyes still on Riley. You're not broken, he said quietly, almost under his breath. Riley didn't respond, but he didn't turn away either. And for Daniel Hayes, that was enough. Early evening settled over the coastal town like a slow exhale, the heat loosening its grip just enough to let the air move again, though not with any real purpose. The sky hovered between pale gold and muted gray, the kind of color that didn't commit to beauty or gloom, only presence. Daniel Hayes drove back with one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely near the gear shift. Riley sat in the back seat without restraint, not because Daniel trusted him, but because the dog hadn't once tried to move beyond his chosen space. That in itself said more than any leash ever could. Riley didn't look out the window, didn't pace, didn't whine. He simply stood for a while when they first got into the truck, then slowly lowered himself onto the worn fabric seat, body angled diagonally, as if positioning himself not for comfort, but for awareness. His head remained slightly lowered, ears shifting subtly with each passing sound outside, though his eyes never locked onto anything specific. It was not disinterest. It was calculation. Daniel noticed everything. Of course he did, but he didn't comment, didn't speak, didn't attempt to establish anything resembling connection. That was not how this worked. Not with a dog like this. Not with anything that had learned to measure the world before stepping into it. When they arrived, Daniel stepped out first, leaving the truck door open behind him. He didn't call Riley, didn't gesture, just walked toward the front of the house, trusting or testing that the dog would make his own decision. Riley took his time. He stepped down from the truck with controlled movement, each paw placed with precision rather than hesitation. He didn't rush to catch up, didn't lag behind either. He followed at a distance that felt intentional, far enough to remain separate, close enough not to lose track. Daniel unlocked the front door and stepped inside without looking back. The house greeted them with the same stillness it always held. No scent of recent activity, no shift in atmosphere, just the quiet presence of a place that had never been asked to hold more than one person at a time. Riley paused at the threshold, not because he was afraid. Daniel could tell the difference. Fear pulled a body backward. This held it still. Riley stood there, head angled slightly, nostrils flaring once as he took in the air. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. No sudden movements. No inspection of corners or surfaces like a typical dog adjusting to new territory. Instead, he moved through the space as if mapping it, walking along the edges, pausing at certain points, not to investigate objects, but to observe the absence of them. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed loosely, watching without interfering. Riley entered the living room and stopped. The front window sat just above eye level for a dog his size, offering a narrow view of the yard and, beyond it, a partial angle toward Margaret Collins's porch. The wind chime hung there, still, unmoving. Riley stood in place longer than before, not staring, not fixating, just holding that direction. Daniel felt it, then not fear, not concern, but a subtle tightening in his chest, the kind that came from recognizing a pattern before fully understanding it. "Yeah," he muttered under his breath. "You see it too." Riley didn't react, but he didn't move away either. That was the first sign. The hours passed without incident. Daniel set a bowl of water down near the kitchen wall. Riley approached it after a delay. Not cautious, not eager, simply deliberate. He drank without lifting his head much, then stepped away before finishing. The food Daniel placed beside it remained untouched for a while longer. There was no destruction, no pacing, no attempt to assert territory. Riley did not claim space. He occupied it. There was a difference. Daniel noticed that the dog never positioned himself fully at rest. Even when he lay down, his body remained partially coiled, limbs not fully extended, weight distributed in a way that allowed immediate movement if necessary. It wasn't anxiety. It was readiness. That, too, Daniel understood. He didn't try to change it. Night came gradually, the last traces of light dissolving into a dim blue that seeped through the windows. Daniel turned on a single lamp near the corner of the room, leaving the rest of the house in shadow. He sat down on the worn couch, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. Riley remained near the front window, still facing outward, not moving. "You're not here for me," Daniel said quietly, not expecting a response. Riley's ear flicked once. That was all. A soft knock sounded at the door. Daniel didn't get up immediately. He didn't need to guess who it was. He opened it after a moment. Margaret Collins stood there, a small paper bag held loosely in her hand. The porch light above her cast a soft halo around her silver hair, emphasizing the fine lines of her face without softening them. "I thought you might need this," she said, extending the bag. Daniel took it without looking inside. "You didn't have to." "I know," she replied. "That's usually when people should." He stepped aside, allowing her in. Margaret entered slowly, her gaze sweeping the room not with curiosity, but with quiet assessment. Then she saw Riley. She stopped. For a brief moment, so brief, it might have been missed. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition. Perhaps, though of what, it was unclear. "Well," she said softly. "So, you're the one." Riley did not approach her, but he turned his head slightly, not toward her face, but toward her hands. Margaret noticed. "Smart," she murmured. "You don't trust easy." Daniel watched the exchange without interrupting. Margaret set the bag down on the table and moved a little closer, though she kept a respectful distance. "He's been looking at my porch," she said, glancing briefly toward the window. Daniel didn't deny it. "Yeah." She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "They usually do." "They?" Daniel asked. Margaret's lips curved faintly, though there was no humor in it. "The ones who listen," she said. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "To what?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her attention back to Riley, studying him more carefully now. "Not everything that makes a sound is meant to be heard," she said finally. Daniel didn't like that answer, which meant there was something in it he recognized. You're saying the chime. I'm saying it remembers, Margaret interrupted gently. Silence followed. Daniel shook his head slightly, more to himself than to her. Metal doesn't remember. Margaret looked at him then, really looked, her gray eyes settling on his face with a quiet intensity that made it difficult to look away. No, she said. But people do, and sometimes that's enough. Riley shifted. For the first time since she entered, he moved away from the window. Not toward her, not toward Daniel, just away, as if adjusting to something unseen. Margaret noticed that too. He's not reacting to the house, she said softly. He's reacting to something tied to it. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. You're making assumptions. I'm making observations, she replied calmly. Same as you. That landed closer than he expected. Margaret stepped back, brushing her hands lightly against her dress. I won't stay, she said. You both need time. She moved toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. If it rings tonight, she added without turning, don't ignore it. Then she left. Daniel closed the door slowly, the click of the latch sounding louder than it should have. He didn't go back to the couch. Instead, he stood near the center of the room, gaze drifting between Riley and the window. The wind chime hung still. Minutes passed. Then, a single, soft metallic note. Riley's head lifted immediately. Another, then a third. There was no wind. Daniel felt it this time, not just tension, but something deeper, something that pressed against the edges of memory without fully forming. Riley let out a low, almost inaudible growl. Not aggressive, not warning. Acknowledgement. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, listening. And for the first time since bringing the dog home, he didn't try to explain it away. Morning arrived in fragments, not as a clean beginning, but as something pieced together from leftover shadows and restless thoughts. The humidity lingered even before the sun fully rose, wrapping the house in a thin, invisible layer that dulled sound and slowed movement. Daniel Hayes had not slept well. Not because of noise, there had been none after the chime, but because of the absence of it. Silence, when it followed something unexplained, always felt heavier than before. He stood in the kitchen, one hand resting against the counter, the other holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. His eyes moved, not scanning, not searching, but drifting between the hallway, the window, and the spot where Riley had been moments ago. The dog was no longer there. Daniel didn't react immediately. He set the cup down slowly and stepped into the living room. Riley stood near the far wall, facing nothing. Not the window this time, not the door, just space. His posture was different now. Not tense, not ready focused. His head slightly tilted, ears shifting in small, controlled movements, as if adjusting to something that didn't align with the rest of the room. His eyes, dark and unreadable, remained fixed on a point where there was no object, no reflection, nothing that should hold attention. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching. You see something? He asked, voice low, even. Riley didn't respond, didn't move, didn't break that invisible line of attention. Daniel felt a faint pressure in his chest again. Not fear, not quite, but something that pressed against the boundary of logic. He pushed it down the way he always did, letting routine take over. All right, he muttered. You do your thing. He turned away, but the image followed him. The day passed in uneven segments. Daniel tried to return to his usual rhythm tools, measurements, the steady logic of mechanical repair, but his focus fractured more easily than before. Twice, he tightened bolts that didn't need tightening. Once, he stood still, long enough for the marina owner, a broad-shouldered man named Frank Delaney, to notice. Frank was in his late 50s, built like someone who had spent decades working rather than exercising, thick forearms, permanent sunburn across his neck, a gray beard that had grown unevenly over time. He wasn't unkind, but he was direct in the way people became when they had stopped pretending subtlety mattered. You gonna fix that boat or stare it back to life? Frank asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel didn't look up, It's already fixed, Frank grunted, stepping closer to inspect the work. Then why are you still here? Daniel didn't answer. Frank glanced at him sideways, then shrugged. You look like hell, he added, not as an insult, just observation. Didn't sleep, Daniel said. Dog? Frank asked. Daniel's jaw shifted slightly. Something like that. Frank nodded once, as if that explained enough. Dogs don't lie, he said. They just don't always explain. Daniel almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, he picked up his tools again, but his movements lacked the precision they usually carried. Because Riley hadn't just been watching nothing. He had been waiting. And Daniel didn't know for what. When he returned home, the air felt different. Not colder, not heavier, just altered. The kind of shift you couldn't point to, but couldn't ignore either. Riley was in the same place. The exact same place. Same posture. Same direction. Hours had passed. Daniel stood in the doorway, longer this time. You didn't move, he said quietly. Riley's ear flicked. That was it. Daniel stepped closer, slower than usual. Not because he was afraid, but because something about the moment demanded care. What is it, Lan? He asked, softer now. Riley didn't look at him, but his body adjusted just slightly as Daniel moved into the space between him and that unseen point. And then it happened. Riley stepped sideways, not retreating, not advancing, blocking. Daniel stopped. The realization came not as a shock, but as a quiet alignment of things that had not made sense before. You're not looking at something, he said under his breath. You're keeping me from it. Riley's body remained still, but the tension in his stance shifted subtle, controlled, intentional. Daniel exhaled slowly. All right, he murmured. I get it, but he didn't. Not fully. Not yet. The knock came again that evening. Margaret Collins didn't wait long before Daniel opened the door this time. She stood there in the fading light, wearing the same simple dress she always wore. The fabric slightly worn at the edges, but clean. Her hair was tied back again, though more loosely now, as if the day had pulled at it. You look worse today, she said without greeting. Thanks, Daniel replied. She stepped inside without asking. Her eyes moved immediately to Riley. He had shifted again, now closer to the hallway, but still angled toward that same invisible space. Margaret watched him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly. He started noticing, she said. Noticing what? Daniel asked, more sharply than he intended. Margaret turned to him, her gaze steady. The same thing my son used to, she said. The words landed heavier than expected. Daniel crossed his arms, more out of instinct than defense. You said he was a SEAL. Margaret nodded. Name was Thomas Collins, she said. Tall, stubborn. Thought he understood things faster than he did. He had your kind of eyes. Daniel didn't react to that, but he didn't dismiss it either. He used to stand in that same spot, she continued, gesturing lightly toward Riley. Said there were moments when things didn't line up right. Daniel's voice lowered. What does that mean? Margaret's lips pressed together briefly, as if deciding how much to say. It means he saw things where nothing was supposed to be, she said. Not shapes, not people, just presence. Daniel shook his head slightly. That's not... He went missing 6 months later, Margaret said, cutting through the sentence cleanly. Silence followed. Not the quiet from before. Something heavier. Daniel looked at Riley again. The dog hadn't moved, but something in the room had. You're connecting things that don't. I'm telling you what I lived, Margaret said, not raising her voice, but removing any softness from it. Daniel didn't respond, because part of him had already started doing the same thing. He just hadn't said it out loud. The air outside had gone completely still. No wind, no movement. Margaret stepped toward the door, then paused. If it happens again, she said, don't step into it. Daniel frowned. Into what? But she didn't answer. She left. The chime rang. Once. Clear. Sharp. Daniel froze. Riley's head lifted instantly. Another. Then silence. Daniel moved. Not fast. Not reckless. But forward. Toward the porch. Riley reacted immediately. He stepped in front of Daniel fast. Precise. No hesitation. Daniel tried to shift around him. Riley adjusted again. Blocking. Move, Daniel said, voice low. Riley didn't. Daniel took another step, and that's when Riley's mouth closed around his hand. Not hard, not enough to break skin, but enough. Enough to stop him. Daniel went still. The pressure held for a second, then released. Riley stepped back, eyes still not meeting his, but his body fully between Daniel and the door. The chime didn't ring again. Daniel looked down at his hand, then back at the dog. You're not warning me, he said quietly. Riley didn't respond, but he didn't move either. And Daniel understood something then, not completely, not clearly, but enough. Riley wasn't reacting to something that was there. He was reacting to something Daniel was about to step into. Late afternoon returned with a heaviness that no longer felt like weather. The air pressed low over the house, not suffocating, but expectant, as if something had already decided it would happen, and everything else was simply waiting to catch up. Daniel Hayes stood at the kitchen table, not moving, his hand resting lightly against the wood, as if grounding himself in something that still obeyed rules. The faint mark on his hand from Riley's teeth had already faded into a dull impression, but the memory of it remained exact. Not aggression, not warning, intervention. That was the word that stayed. He hadn't slept much again, but this time it wasn't restlessness. It was clarity that refused to settle. He turned his head slightly toward the living room. Riley was not in the same place anymore. That alone meant something had changed. Daniel stepped forward, slower now, not cautious, but attentive in a way he had not allowed himself to be before. Riley stood near the hallway entrance, not facing the porch, not staring into empty space. Instead, his body was angled between 2 points, the window and the corridor, as if holding awareness in both directions at once. His posture was no longer rigid, but it was not relaxed either. It was measured. Daniel watched him for a long moment. Then he spoke, not as a command, but as a statement. You're tracking something. Riley's ear shifted, just once. Daniel nodded slightly, as if confirming it to himself rather than expecting agreement. He moved to the table and picked up a small notepad, something he hadn't used in years. His handwriting came back slower than he expected, the letters uneven at first, before settling into something more controlled. Time, position, sound, reaction. He wrote the words down without overthinking them, anchoring observation into structure. If Riley's behavior followed a pattern, then the pattern could be traced. And if it could be traced, it could be understood. That had always been the rule. Outside, the light shifted. Daniel glanced at the clock, then back at Riley. The dog had not moved, but something in his stance tightened just slightly. Daniel wrote the time down, 5:42 p.m. No sound yet. He didn't move toward the porch this time. He stayed where he was, watching, waiting. The silence stretched, but it no longer felt empty. It felt layered. Then one soft metallic note, not loud, not sharp, just present. Riley didn't growl, didn't move forward. He lowered his head. Daniel's hand stopped mid-writing. That's new, he said under his breath. Another note didn't follow. Instead, the air returned to stillness, but the moment lingered. Daniel looked at the notepad. Time. Reaction. No aggression. He exhaled slowly. This wasn't random. It had never been random. He just hadn't been willing to see it that way. The knock came later than usual. Margaret Collins stepped in without waiting again, though this time her expression carried something different. Not just curiosity, not just quiet knowing. There was strain there now. Faint but visible, like a line pulled too tight over time. You stayed, she said simply. Daniel didn't respond directly. He didn't stop me this time, he said instead, nodding toward Riley. Margaret's eyes moved to the dog. Riley didn't acknowledge her presence the way he had before. He didn't turn, didn't shift, didn't offer even the smallest adjustment. He was listening, not to her, not to Daniel, something else. Margaret stepped further inside, slower than usual. "It's getting clearer," she said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "You said your son used to notice this." Margaret nodded. At first, he thought it was stress. Then, patterns. Then, something else. She paused, as if deciding whether the next words were worth saying. He started writing things down too. Daniel looked at her more directly now. "You still have them?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded again. "I never threw anything away." Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to the notepad in his hand. Parallel lines, different time. That thought came uninvited, but it stayed. "Bring them," he said. Margaret studied him for a second, as if measuring whether he understood what he was asking. Then she nodded once more. "I will." She turned toward the door, but before stepping out, she added, "When it happens tonight, don't interrupt it." Daniel frowned slightly. "You're assuming it will happen again." Margaret didn't look back. "It always does," she said, and left. The door closed softly behind her. Daniel stood there for a moment, then returned his attention to Riley. The dog had shifted again, not location position. His body was now angled slightly toward the window, but not fully. Balanced, waiting. Daniel checked the time again. 7:13 p.m. He wrote it down. The room darkened gradually, the fading light slipping through the window in uneven patches. Daniel didn't turn on the lamp this time. He let the shadows settle naturally, letting his eyes adjust instead of forcing clarity. If there was a pattern, artificial light might interfere. That thought would have sounded unreasonable a day ago. It didn't now. Time passed. Daniel didn't move. Riley didn't either. Then 3. Clear, metallic chimes. 1, 2, 3. Each spaced evenly. Not random. Not drifting. Structured. Daniel's chest tightened. Not from fear, but from recognition. He didn't step forward, didn't speak. Riley lowered his head again. Not submissive, not fearful, acknowledging, like marking something. Daniel's grip on the notepad tightened slightly. "You're counting," he said quietly. Riley didn't respond, but Daniel knew. This wasn't about sound. It was about sequence. He wrote it down quickly. 3 chimes. Equal spacing. Dog response. Head lowered. No aggression. No blocking. The silence that followed felt different this time. Not empty. Not heavy. Complete. Riley remained where he was, head still lowered for a few seconds longer before slowly lifting it again. His posture relaxed not fully, but enough to signal a shift. Daniel exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "You're not afraid of it," he said. "You're tracking it." Riley turned slightly not toward Daniel, but just enough to break the alignment he had held before. The moment had passed. Daniel looked down at the page again. Time, pattern, reaction. He had spent years avoiding patterns that led back to things he didn't want to face. But this was different, because this wasn't pulling him backward. It was asking him to stay, and that was something he had never learned how to do. He closed the notepad slowly. Across the room, Riley moved for the first time in minutes, stepping away from the window and settling near the hallway entrance again. Not guarding, not blocking, just repositioning. Daniel watched him. "All right," he said quietly. "We do it your way." Riley didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. And for now, that was enough. The night didn't end cleanly. It thinned into morning without resolution, like a thought interrupted before it could form into something useful. A pale, washed-out light crept through the window, flattening the room into something almost unreal, as if everything inside had been stripped of depth. Daniel Hayes was already awake, seated at the table where the notepad still lay open, his handwriting from the night before, staring back at him in uneven lines. Time, pattern, reaction. He read the words again, slower this time, not to understand them, but to delay what they were leading toward. Across the room, Riley was lying down now, but not fully stretched. his body still angled toward the hallway, as if sleep had only been negotiated, not accepted. Daniel stood, pushing the chair back with a quiet scrape, and walked toward the sink. Running water he didn't need, just to hear something predictable. But even that felt hollow now, because the pattern wasn't outside. It hadn't been for a while. He dried his hands slowly, then turned. Riley was watching him. Not directly, never directly, but the shift was there. A line of awareness drawn tighter than before. Daniel leaned back against the counter. "You're not tracking the house," he said quietly. "You're tracking me." Riley didn't move, but the silence between them had changed. Daniel felt it then, not as a realization, but as something reopening. Not a new thought, an old one, forced back into motion. He grabbed the notepad again, flipping to a fresh page, but his hand didn't move this time, because the next thing he needed to write wasn't about the dog. The memory didn't arrive all at once. It never did. It came in fragments, texture before image, sensation before meaning. Heat, dust, the smell of something burned too long. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again, but the room didn't fully return. He wasn't in South Carolina anymore. Not entirely. He was somewhere else. Years back. A mission that had never officially gone wrong, because on paper, it had followed protocol. That was the problem with paper. It didn't record hesitation. It didn't record the seconds where decisions were made for reasons that didn't translate into reports. Riley stood up, slow, controlled. He didn't approach Daniel. He didn't need to. He just shifted into a position where his body aligned not with the room, but with Daniel's movement, like he was adjusting to something internal rather than external. Daniel exhaled sharply, dragging a hand across his face. "Not now," he muttered, though there was no one to hear it. But it was already happening. The hallway in his house stretched just a little too long in his vision, the edges blurring into something else, something narrower, enclosed. A corridor, concrete, echoing, a voice behind him. Not loud, not panicked, just there. He turned his head slightly, instinct overriding thought, but there was no one, just the empty hallway of his house. Riley moved again, this time, closer. Not enough to touch, just enough to interrupt the alignment between Daniel and that memory space. Blocking, not aggressively, precisely. Daniel stopped moving. His chest rose slowly as he inhaled, forcing air into something that felt like it had forgotten how to expand. "You were there," he said, voice lower now. Not to Riley, not to anyone in the room, just stating it, because that was the part he had avoided. Not the mission, not the outcome, the moment, the one where everything had narrowed into a single choice. Retreat or hold. Protocol said retreat. The structure had been compromised, extraction window closing, risk assessment clear, but there had been someone behind him, a man he knew, not well, but enough to recognize the tone of his voice when he said, "Go." Not a command, not a plea, just acceptance. Daniel pressed his hand against the table now, harder than before. "I didn't leave him," he said, under his breath. "I followed orders." The words sounded hollow the moment they settled into the air, because that wasn't the argument anymore. It hadn't been for years. Riley stepped forward again, closer this time, his head lowered, not in submission, but in alignment, mirroring the same angle Daniel's shoulders had taken, matching tension, not correcting it, reflecting it. The knock at the door came too suddenly. Daniel straightened immediately, the memory snapping back just enough for the room to reassemble around him. He didn't move right away, but Riley did. The dog turned his head toward the door, attention shifting cleanly, as if whatever had been happening a moment ago had been noted and set aside. Daniel opened the door. Margaret Collins stood there, but something about her had changed. Her posture was tighter, her shoulders drawn inward slightly, as if holding something in place that might otherwise collapse. In her hands was a small stack of worn notebooks, edges softened with age, pages uneven from use. "I brought them," she said. Daniel stepped aside. She entered, without waiting, Her eyes moved through the room quickly, not searching, but checking. Then they landed on Riley. He didn't move toward her this time. Didn't acknowledge her in any visible way, but he didn't ignore her either. His presence adjusted, just slightly, as if accounting for her within the space. Margaret set the notebooks down on the table carefully, almost reverently. "He wrote everything down," she said. "Every time it happened." Daniel looked at them, but didn't touch them yet. "What happened?" he asked. Margaret swallowed, her fingers tightening briefly against the edge of the table. "He said things didn't match," she said. "Time, space, moments repeating where they shouldn't." Daniel finally picked up one of the notebooks. The cover was plain, the pages filled with tight, controlled handwriting. Not rushed, not scattered, structured. He flipped through it. Dates, times, notes, and then phrases. Not descriptions of things seen, descriptions of dissonance. Felt like I stepped into the wrong second. Sound didn't belong to the space. Had to stop before it lined up. Daniel's jaw tightened, because that language, it wasn't unfamiliar. Margaret's voice softened, but the strain in it didn't fade. "He stopped sleeping," she said, "started waiting instead." Daniel looked up at her. "For what?" Margaret shook her head slightly. "He never said." Silence settled again, not heavy, not empty, just present. Daniel looked back at Riley. The dog was watching him now, not directly, not fully, but closer than before. Not avoiding, not engaging, observing. And then it clicked. Not as a sudden revelation, as a quiet correction. "You're not reacting to something out there," Daniel said slowly. "You're reacting to when I start going somewhere else." Riley didn't move. But he didn't look away either. Margaret frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel closed the notebook. "I mean, it's not the house," he said. "It's not the chime." He paused, just long enough for the words to settle into something real. "It's me." Margaret didn't respond immediately, because she understood, or at least enough of it. Daniel looked at his hand again, where Riley had stopped him the night before. Not warning, not protection. Interruption. "You weren't stopping me from walking out the door," he said quietly. "You were stopping me from stepping back into it." Riley lowered his head slightly. Not in acknowledgement, not in agreement, but in that same measured way he had the night before. Recording. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders shifting, not gone, but repositioned. For the first time, he wasn't trying to dismiss it. And that changed everything. Dusk settled slowly, not as a dramatic shift, but as a quiet agreement between light and shadow. The sky dimming into a muted blue that carried neither warmth nor warning. The air held still again, not heavy this time, but watchful. Daniel Hayes stood just inside the doorway, fingers resting lightly against the frame, as if measuring the distance between staying and stepping forward. He had spent years moving around things, memories, decisions, moments that demanded more than observation. But now the movement itself had become the problem. Behind him, Riley remained still, positioned not as a barrier, not as a guard, but as something else entirely. A witness. Daniel stepped outside, not abruptly, not with resolve, just forward. The wooden porch creaked faintly under his weight, the sound small but real, grounding him in the present in a way that memory never could. The wind chime hung there, unmoving, its thin strips of metal dulled by time, but still intact, still waiting. Daniel lowered himself into the chair near the edge of the porch, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped together. He didn't look at the chime immediately. He let the space settle first, let the silence return on its own terms. Behind him, Riley did not follow. Daniel noticed that, and for the first time, he didn't interpret it as distance. He understood it as allowance. "You're letting me do this," he said quietly. More statement than question. The house remained silent. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze finally lifting to the wind chime. The memory tried to come again, not in fragments this time, but in pressure. He didn't push it away. That was the difference now. He let it press, let it move closer. The porch shifted not physically, but in perception. The edges softened, the shadows lengthened, and for a moment, the space felt narrower than it should have been. Not his porch, not entirely. He inhaled slowly, and stayed. The sound came, one soft, metallic strike, then another, then a third, even, measured, familiar. Daniel didn't move. He didn't look away. The memory stepped forward this time, not dragging him into it, but aligning with him. The corridor returned not fully, not overwhelming, but present enough that he could see it layered over the porch. Concrete walls, dust in the air, a shape behind him that never quite formed into a face. Just presence. Go, the voice said again. Not loud, not urgent, just certain. Daniel's jaw tightened. I heard you, he said, voice low, steady, directed not outward, but inward. The air didn't shift. The chime didn't ring again. But something inside the moment changed. For the first time, he didn't move away from it. He didn't follow the instinct to step forward into action or backward into retreat. He stayed exactly where he was. And that was new. Margaret Collins stood at the edge of her own porch, watching. She had not meant to come outside. Her body had simply carried her there when the first chime sounded. She wore the same simple dress as always, though it hung a little looser now, as if something inside her had thinned with time. Her silver hair had slipped partially loose from its knot, strands falling across her cheek, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on Daniel's house. She could see him, sitting, not moving. Her hands tightened slightly against the railing. He's staying, she murmured to herself. The words didn't carry relief. They carried recognition. Margaret turned slowly, stepping back inside her house. The wind chime above her own porch remained still. She reached up, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. For years, she had let it hang there, not because she believed it could bring anything back, but because removing it felt like admitting something had ended. Her hand closed around the string. For a moment, she didn't pull. Then she did. The chime came free easily, lighter than she expected, as if it had never truly belonged there in the first place. Margaret held it in both hands, looking at it not with longing, not with grief, but with something quieter. Acceptance. She turned toward the door. Back on his porch, Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest shifting, not gone, not resolved, but no longer pushing him in any direction. He lowered his head briefly, then lifted it again. You weren't telling me to go, he said, the realization settling into place. You were giving me the choice. The memory didn't respond. It didn't need to. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. The porch was just a porch. The chime hung still. The corridor was gone, not erased, just no longer layered over the present. He sat there a moment longer, then leaned back in the chair, shoulders relaxing in a way they hadn't in a long time. Not relief, not peace, something simpler, space. Behind him, a faint shift of movement. Daniel didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. He could feel it. Riley stepped onto the porch, slow, measured, not hesitant, just present. The dog moved to Daniel's side, stopping a short distance away. For a moment, he stood there, body aligned with the same direction Daniel had been facing, as if confirming the space was clear. Then, gradually, Riley turned. Not his body, his head, lifting it just enough. His eyes met Daniel's, fully, directly. For the first time, there was no avoidance in it, no deflection, no calculation, just presence. Daniel didn't look away, didn't speak. He held the gaze, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as acknowledgement. You're done blocking, he said quietly. Riley didn't respond, but he didn't break the eye contact either, and that said enough. Margaret crossed the narrow path between the houses, the wind chime held carefully in her hands. She moved slower than usual, not from weakness, but from intention. Each step deliberate, as if she were placing something down with every movement she made. She stopped at the edge of Daniel's porch. He looked up at her. She lifted the chime slightly. "It doesn't belong to me anymore," she said. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded once. She stepped forward and placed it gently on the small table beside the chair. The metal pieces shifted slightly, brushing against each other with a soft, almost absent sound. Not a chime, just contact. Margaret stepped back. "He waited," she said quietly. "I didn't understand that before." Daniel didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Margaret turned, walking back toward her house without looking behind her. The space she left behind didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Daniel leaned back in the chair again, his gaze shifting briefly to the wind chime now resting beside him. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Riley lowered himself onto the porch floor, his body finally relaxing fully, legs stretching out in a way Daniel hadn't seen before. No readiness, no tension, just rest. Daniel looked down at him, then back at the quiet space in front of them, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to leave it. Late afternoon returned without ceremony. A thin band of gold pressed low against the horizon, as if the day had decided to end quietly rather than leave a mark. The coastal air carried the same soft salt it always had, but something in the way it moved slower and less insistent made the space feel wider than before. Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of his porch, one hand resting against the wooden frame, not leaning on it, just aware of it. The house behind him felt the same walls, the same quiet rooms, the same absence of unnecessary things. But it no longer felt like a place built to avoid something. It felt like a place that had stopped asking questions. Riley lay a few feet away, his body fully stretched for the first time since arriving. Front legs extended forward, back legs relaxed in a way that had once seemed impossible for him. His breathing was slow, steady, not measured in readiness anymore, but in rest. The sharp edges that had defined him, the constant awareness, the controlled positioning, had softened, not disappeared, just no longer necessary. Daniel watched him for a moment, then stepped down from the porch, moving toward the narrow strip of yard that separated his house from Margaret Collins' place. The distance between the two had never been large, but it felt different now, not because it had changed physically, but because something unspoken between the houses had finally been acknowledged. Margaret's porch was empty. The door stood slightly ajar, not open, not closed, just left in that in-between position that suggested departure rather than absence. Daniel approached slowly, not out of caution, but out of respect for a space that had held more than it appeared to. He knocked once, lightly. No answer. He waited a moment longer, then pushed the door open, just enough to look inside. The house was clean. Not staged, not arranged, just settled. As if someone had taken care to leave it in a state that required no explanation. A few items remained: a chair, a small table, a folded blanket draped over the back of it, but the details that made a place feel inhabited had been carefully removed. She had left, not abruptly, not unexpectedly, just completely. Daniel stepped back, closing the door gently behind him. He stood there for a second, looking at the wind chime still hanging from the edge of her porch, or rather, where it had once hung. The space was empty now, the hook bare, the faint outline of its presence marked only by a lighter patch in the wood where the sun had not reached. "She didn't take it," he said quietly. Behind him, Riley had followed, not closely, not at a distance either, just there. Daniel turned slightly, glancing at the dog. Riley wasn't looking at the house. He wasn't looking at the empty hook or the doorway or anything that had once drawn his attention so intensely. He was simply present. Daniel nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, then turned back toward his own house. The days that followed didn't announce themselves as different. There was no clear moment where something shifted from one state into another. Instead, things unfolded in small adjustments that only became noticeable when placed side by side with what had come before. Daniel returned to the marina. Frank Delaney noticed the change immediately, though he didn't comment on it right away. He watched from a distance at first, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, his thick frame still carrying the same grounded weight as always. His gray beard caught the light differently, now that the sun had shifted lower in the season, but his eyes, sharp, practical, remained unchanged. "You're not staring at bolts anymore," Frank said eventually, stepping closer. Daniel didn't look up, didn't realize that was a habit. Frank shrugged. Wasn't a good one. Daniel tightened the last fitting on a small engine part, then set the tool down. "It's fixed," he said. Frank glanced at the work, then back at him. "So are you?" Daniel paused, not because he didn't understand the question, because he didn't need to answer it the way Frank expected. "I'm staying," he said instead. Frank studied him for a second longer than usual, then nodded once. "That'll do," he muttered, turning away. It wasn't approval. It wasn't approval needed. It was acknowledgement, and that was enough. Back at the house, the rhythm settled. Not structured, not forced, just consistent. Riley followed Daniel now, not out of obligation, not out of training, but because the space between them had changed. He no longer kept distance as a default. He chose proximity in moments that mattered, when Daniel moved from one room to another, when he stepped outside, when he paused, for no reason other than to exist in the space without purpose. There were still moments where Riley would stop, where his attention would shift towards something unseen, but those moments no longer carried tension. They passed without escalation, without the need for interruption. Daniel noticed them, but he didn't chase them. He let them exist without demanding explanation. That was the difference. The wind chime sat on the small table inside the house for 3 days. Daniel didn't touch it, not because he didn't know what to do with it, because he understood that deciding too quickly would turn it into something it wasn't meant to be. On the 4th day, he picked it up. The metal strips felt cooler than expected, lighter too, as if the weight it once carried had never belonged to the material itself. He turned it slightly in his hands, watching the way the pieces shifted, brushing softly against each other without sound. Then he walked outside. Riley followed. Daniel stepped onto the porch and looked at the empty space above him, where his own hook, unused, unnoticed for years, sat waiting. He didn't hesitate. He lifted the chime and hung it there. The metal settled into place with a faint, nearly silent contact. Daniel stepped back. Riley lowered himself onto the porch floor, not watching the chime, not reacting to the movement. His body relaxed, his head resting lightly against his paws. The air remained still. No wind, no movement. Daniel leaned against the railing, arms resting loosely, his gaze not fixed on the chime, but not avoiding it either. Time passed. Not measured, not tracked, just allowed. Then, a soft shift. Not sound, not exactly. The chime moved. Just enough. One piece brushing lightly against another. A faint metallic whisper. Daniel didn't straighten, didn't step forward, didn't search for a cause. He simply watched. Riley didn't move, didn't lift his head, didn't respond. No growl, no alertness, no need. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without resistance. It wasn't explanation he felt, not closure. Something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps, or maybe just the absence of the need to define it. He looked down at Riley for a moment, then back at the space in front of him. The porch creaked softly under his weight, the sound grounding, real, unchanged. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the urge to step away from it. Sometimes the miracle is not what we see, but what we are finally willing to face. Not every answer comes as a sign, and not every silence is empty. In Daniel's story, nothing was clearly explained, yet something shifted, and maybe that is how God works in our lives. Not always through loud moments, but through quiet changes in the heart, through the courage to stay when everything in us wants to leave. In your own life, there may be things you don't understand, memories you avoid, or questions that never seem to resolve. But perhaps grace is already there, gently asking you to pause, to listen, and to remain. If this story touched you, take a moment to share where you are watching from and what you are holding on to today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe To support more stories like this, may God watch over you, bring you peace in the places you struggle, and guide you gently toward the strength you didn't know you had.